System in the world that we see today. There were trials and errors, experiments that worked, experiments that didn't, lessons that were learned, and eventually the conditions were in place for there to be capitalism on a global scale. So to discover that the early experiments in socialism, Russia, China, and so on, weren't the final end, didn't solve all the problems, didn't work out exactly right, is something you should all have expected, rather than taken as evidence that there's something not viable about this. That would be historically weird as a conclusion, given what we know about every other system. Well then, what have the criticisms among socialists, and Marxists, and communists about what happened in the Soviet Union and China? Where have they gone to? What lessons have they drawn from it? And again, we can go into this in conversation later, I hope, but let me give you the summary report. The criticism is this, that the interpretations of Marx's critique of capitalism that focused on having the state come in and take over ownership and operation of enterprises, having planning substitute for markets, that was way too, and now I'm going to use an economics term, don't get upset, way too macroeconomic. We're too focused on the big issues. Who owns stuff? Who shapes distribution? It didn't pay attention to the micro level. It didn't pay attention particularly to what goes on inside the enterprise. It acted as if that really didn't matter very much. So long as the government took over and ran the enterprise, and so long as government planners distributed, we'd get socialism. That what was the obstacle to socialism was the private nature of property and the market as an institution. By the way, this old idea, which socialists are now rejecting, has not been rejected, by the way, by the New York Times, for example. For the New York Times, capitalism is free markets and free enterprise, and socialism, communism is government markets and planning. They live in a definition that the people they use it for have rejected for 20 years. That's what happens if you have a repression of a discourse in a society the way we have had. They're really behind the times. Why? Because where socialists are going now is saying, wait a minute, what did Karl Marx focus on if he didn't focus on planning? There is no argument in Marx about planning. No sustained argument ever. There's no sustained argument about public versus private enterprise either. Wow, so the things that were picked up by Marxists and socialists are not things that Marx himself focused on. What did old Marx focus on, and might it give us a clue about another way to interpret socialism? The answer is, yeah, he focused someplace else, and yeah, it gives us a clue, and I'm going to tell you what it is. What Marx focuses on is the process of production, what goes on inside the enterprise, where you work. 9 to 5, 5 days a week. When you go to work, what goes on there? How do people interact there? That's what he was interested in. That's what the 3 volumes of Capital, which is what his great achievement, well, I mean, he wrote a lot of other things too, but that was his great achievement. That's what he was interested in. How does production work? And he was very critical of the capitalist way of producing, and he was clearly in favor of an alternative. Wow. That means that socialism is now going back to Marx, finding in him this discussion of the enterprise and redefining what socialism is. And I think it's worth your attention because it's going to be what socialism is for the rest of your lives. It's the socialism of the 21st century, which is different from the socialism of the 19th and 20th centuries. Here we go. The critique of Marx can best be shown, please folks, don't get worried, I am now going to do economic arithmetic. This is always a dangerous moment because there are certain folks who have been trained in a certain way, nobody's fault, If you start writing arithmetic on the board, their eyes glaze over, their brains go on vacation, and they get frightened. Don't. This is really very simple. Okay. In Marx's way of thinking, capitalism is easily represented in the following way of understanding what the process of production is. And because Marx is interested in human beings, and Marx is interested in how people relate to one another, because that's what he's concerned with, he's going to analyze what happens in production in terms of labor, of this activity people give themselves to when they go to work, and how they relate to one another as they go about transforming nature into chairs and software programs and haircuts and everything else. Okay? So we're going to start this way. Every act of production makes use of some kinds of tools, equipment, raw material, whatever. For example, let's use a chair as an example. If you're going to make a chair, you need some wood and some glue and maybe some nails and a hammer, and you get the idea. And all of those things that are used in production were made by human beings, labor, that's now available for us to use to make more things. Somebody did work a while ago to make the hammer, which I'm going to now use to make the chair. Somebody a while ago put together whatever needed to make the glue that I use and to cut the trees into the lumber that I use. And so we're going to use a simple EL, embodied labor. Every production makes use of embodied labor, labor that's embodied in some product that was done earlier that's now an input to what we're doing now. Basically, simple idea. Here comes another simple idea. With this embodied labor, labor embodied in all the tools, equipment, and raw material, production involves the addition of living labor, the worker, you, him, her, the people working. So we're going to call that living labor. Embodied labor plus living labor gives you the total labor in whatever we produce in an economy. It's real simple. Okay? You can say it in other words. There's the value of all the stuff we use up when we produce, tools, equipment, and raw materials. And then there's the value added by the worker who uses those pieces of equipment to transform the raw material into the final. So this is nails, glue, lumber. This is the chair maker's effort, and the outcome is the chair. Okay? This is very simple. What is capitalism about? By some process, which we can talk about later, the embodied labor, the work done by working people in the past, becomes the private property of a few people. You know their names. They're called employers. They didn't make this stuff. Absolutely not. Somebody else did. Workers. But those workers didn't get to keep what they produced. They lost what they produced, and it became the property of somebody else. And that capitalist brings to the production process whatever it is he owns. Let's just say, just to make it simple, that it's worth 100. It doesn't matter what it is, just 100 of anything. So we know we're using up in making chairs 100 worth of hammers, nails, glue, lumber, all of that. And now the worker adds value to what he or she produces by transforming the lumber, nails, and glue into a new finished thing called a chair or a sofa or any other piece of output. Okay, and let's, just to make it real simple, say it's another 100. And so the final chair is worth 200. I told you this would be easy. 100 plus 100 equals 200. Economists think this is an enormous achievement here, but most of you probably don't. The arithmetic is simple. Okay? Now let's follow the logic as Marx did. This is what a capitalist does. He brings 100 of what he's come to acquire somehow, we don't know how. And by the way, we never asked the capitalist quite how he got it, do we? It's really only, do you got it or do you not have it? And if you have it, you can be the employer. And if you don't, you can't. The fact that the employer who has it didn't produce it is a nagging problem we prefer not to ask. But we'll come back to it. And you know you can't be an employer because you don't have it. You didn't get it. Somebody else did. So the capitalist brings his 100. But he uses that up. That's the tools and equipment used up. So that 100 shows up in the chair as half of the 200 that chair is worth. And we know that the chair is worth 200 because in addition to the 100 of stuff used up, there was 100 more value added by the worker who worked to make the chair that's worth 200. Now, says Marx, and you're going to say it with me because you're going to understand this. Now Marx says, let's see. For the capitalist, he wants to get back what he laid out, the 100. He gave 100 to the production process. So when he sells the chair at 200, he's going to take 100 of it to replace the tools and equipment and raw materials used up in producing the chair. That's how he can keep on being a chair capitalist. That's how he can keep production going. He has to replace the tools, equipment, and raw materials he used up, doesn't he? Yeah, he does. I don't have the time to be Socratic because we don't have enough time. Okay, let's see. So out of the 200 worth of chair, you need to take 100 to replace what you used up. That leaves you with 100 after you sell the chair. What are you going to do with the 100? You could, here we go now, because this is the crucial part. You could take the other 100 and you could give it to the worker. Because after all, it was the worker whose labor added the 100 of value to this stuff to make the 200. You could, couldn't you? And the logic would be, gee, the worker added the value, he or she, here we go folks, should get it. Because he gave it. He created it. He made it happen, he should get it. Do you think that happens in capitalism? No, you don't, do you? We don't give the worker the value added. Ever in capitalism. It's not how it works. You all know that. But I'm putting it kind of right up front and bold for you to deal with. What is it that capitalists do? They divide that 100 into two parts. One part is what we pay the worker. I'll be generous and say 50. Now you get it. If you made a chair of 200 and you used 100 to replace the tools, equipment, and raw materials you used up, and you used another 50 to pay the workers, that leaves what? 50. Good. Higher math of economics. 50. And Marx called this the surplus. It's what the capitalist has left over after he pays out to himself the 100 worth of tools, equipment, and raw materials he contributed that got used up, and he pays the workers. He's got to pay the workers, because if he doesn't, they won't show up anymore, and the game is over. So to keep it going, he has to replace the tools and equipment, and he has to pay the workers. But he has to pay the workers, here we go, folks, less than the value added by the workers when they work. Or to use the technical term economists like, he has to rip the workers off. He has to steal from them part of what their labor added. You know what the lesson here is? For those of you who imagined that when you graduate from here you will get a job, in fact the only job you will accept is one that pays you what you're worth. Never gonna happen. The condition of your employment is that you produce more by your labor than you get paid. Welcome to the capitalist system. That's how it works. This thing, surplus, that's profits. That's where the profits of enterprise come from. The best way to describe your work in a capitalist enterprise is not that the employer gives you a job, it's that you give your employer the surplus. The giver and the getter are in reversed order from what the language suggests. You are doing wonderful things for your employer, and they will keep you in that job exactly as long as you can keep producing a surplus adequate to what they need. Okay? That's step one. Volume 1 of Capital lays all that out. And for those of you who have never seen this before, no one has ever done this with you before, this simple took me 5 minutes. Now you get a taste of that repression that I talked to you about at the beginning. That's what happens in a society which is not allowed to think like this. So for some of you, maybe it's the first time. Let's continue. What does the capitalist do with the surplus? A lot of things. A lot of things. And they're very interesting and they shape the economy. In order for the capitalist to survive, he's got to take this 50 that he appropriates from the worker who produced it, and he's got to make sure it's distributed in society to keep himself in office, to keep himself in the job, to keep the capitalist system going. He has to take steps to make sure that this stuff keeps on happening. He can't, as you might imagine, take the 50 of surplus and have a wonderful evening on the town, going to an expensive restaurant and a lovely piece of theater and then a trip to the Bahamas. He wouldn't be a capitalist very long. He's got to make sure that things are taken care of in this society. Let me give you an example. It's possible that these workers, let me be more blunt, that people like you in a job might encounter a person like me in a classroom, which would mean the next day when you come to work, your attitude might have changed. You would be beginning to understand that at the end of the day of a job that you've had, when you had that funny feeling and spoke to a person right next to you on the way out of the building, you feel vaguely, I don't know, ripped off. Yes, good, you got it. There's a reason why you do. You're actually paying attention. Most people in capitalism feel that way. It doesn't show up in the language. We have to disguise it, so we do. Here's an example. At the end of the working day, on your way home, you stop somewhere before you get home. And you stop in a place where you can sit down and have a drink. And the name of this experience in our culture is called happy hour, to help you understand what the previous hours aren't. It's your happy time, because the other 8 hours, to use another technical term, suck, don't they? Don't they? The culture does recognize it. It does. It just needs a little help interpreting. So it gets distributed, this surplus. You know what it does? It's taken by capitalists and it's given to, I don't know, let's see some institutions who get distributions of the surplus. In many capitalist societies, capitalists support local churches. And why might they do that? Because in the church something is taught that says none of what I've just described is going on. Or maybe they fund a university. Maybe they take a part of the surplus and make a beautiful building, sort of, you know, like this one. And why might they do that? Because in the university, like in the church, a completely different story is told about all of this. Let me give you an example. Here's a way to understand economics. Production is a wonderful, harmonious collaboration The worker brings his labor, the landlord brings the land, and the capitalist brings the money and the equipment and the factory. And they all cooperate to produce the output, and then they divide the revenue earned amongst each of them in proportion to the contribution each has made. You might call this fairsies. This is an economics in which everybody is fairly treated. It makes you vibrate with the harmony of it all. That's how we teach economics in the United States. I know that because for 50 years I did that. That's what we taught, because that's what we learned. And that's no accident, because that's a completely different story from this one. In that story, everybody gets in proportion to what they contribute. Fairsies. There's no surplus, there's no ripping off, you got nobody to be angry at. If you don't have more wealth than you would like, it's your own damn fault you didn't contribute more. So how can you expect to get more? It's wonderfully comforting. It's like knowing that there's somebody up there who, despite everything else, really likes you, even though your best friend doesn't. Okay, it's very important. Here are some other things that have to happen. Suppose these workers, for one way or another, discover they don't like this arrangement. They might decide one day to come into work and say, you know, you're a nice boss and all that, but we're not doing this anymore. You want us to work and add value of 100, we want the 100. Because we do it, we add the value, you give us the 100. And the employer says no, and things get kind of ugly. At that point, the employer has an option. Very interesting option. He can go and pick up the phone, and he can call a place in town. And he says, you know, I'm getting scared, and very quickly something interesting happens. A truck or a van leaves an office downtown filled with people in dark blue uniforms who come right to your workplace with a big stick and beat up on these people to help them change their mind. It's called the police. And for the capitalist to do what he does and be what he is, he has to have that phone there. And there has to be a bunch of people in blue uniforms, and there has to be a van, and there has to be an office, and that all costs money. Where do you think that comes from? That's another use of the surplus. Let me pick some that aren't so confrontational with you. The capitalist also, in order to be a capitalist, he has to make sure that these 100 value added by workers, that the workers know what they're doing. He wants to be able to hire workers who know how to add and know how to read and know how to take orders. They need, in short, to go to school, to learn those things. And the capitalist knows he has to take a part of the surplus to sustain the school system. So he pays a part of the surplus in taxes to the government to run the schools, to teach the people so they can produce the value added when he hires them. The surplus has to be distributed. Marx goes through all this, by the way. All the different ways the surplus is distributed to keep this system going. And you know what it adds up to, says Marx? The way the surplus is used by the employer who gets the surplus is to keep himself in the dominant position, to keep this system going, and that's what he wants because he's the guy at the top. He's the guy who gets the surplus. He's the guy who knows how to use it in such a way as to keep himself in the dominant position, which he's been doing a good job of for 200 years or so that we've had capitalism. Done a good job. What's the implication of this for socialism? What is socialism, given what I've described here? I'm going to answer the question. You're going to see where socialism is now going way different from what it was before. Socialism now becomes this story, this surplus, but instead of the surplus going from one group of people, the workers, to another group of people, the employers, that's over. The implication of Marxist theory is that a new and different society is one that would say here, in this situation, the workers will still come to work, they'll still add 100 of value, they'll get 50 for themselves for their wages and their income, but the other 50, the surplus, they get that. They don't give that to anybody else. They take it and collectively, democratically decide what to do with the surplus they themselves produced. That's what socialism is about. That's the end of capitalism. No more capitalists. The workers who produce the surplus, as individual effort outputters, you might say, then collectively and democratically decide what to do with the surplus they have produced. They become, to use a language that as an American you might find easier, they become their own boss, don't they? In the only way that's actually available to them, to become their own boss in a collective way. What is the simple American phrase that captures this? Worker co-op. It's very old. You don't even need Marxism either. All that Marxism does is provide us with the logic and a roadmap back to capture what it was that made people all through history decide that working cooperatively, producing a worker co-op, is an attractive way to organize work, is an attractive institution to pursue. That's why you have examples of it thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, and right now. But it's going to take off now because it isn't an idiosyncratic, odd, leftover from an earlier period. It is a new direction. So let me conclude with spelling out for you what I've just told you. Socialism, having changed dramatically, is basically saying that what went wrong in the Soviet Union and China was that they never transformed the workplaces. They never created democratic decisions. What they did is substitute private owners of businesses and put in government officials. For the average worker, it didn't mean all that much. They didn't have the workers make the decisions collectively what to do with the surplus they produced. They didn't do that. They substituted planning for markets, they substituted public for private ownership, but they didn't change the micro-level organization. Another way to say it, the co-op represents, like the critique of capitalism here represents, an appeal for the democratization of enterprises, to bring democracy to the workplace. Now, think with me in the final 5 minutes that I take. Think with me what I am saying. You live in a society that makes a fetish out of claiming that it is a democracy. If democracy means anything, it means that if you're affected by a decision, you have the right to participate in making it. That's why we vote for the mayor, because the mayor of our town makes the decisions that affect us. We have to have influence. Okay, if you believe in democracy, then the first place it should have been instituted is at the workplace. Why? Because that's where you spend most of your adult life. 5 out of 7 days, when you're an adult, you're at work. And for many of the other hours, you're either recuperating from happy hour or getting ready for work. If you believe in democracy, then the workplace would have been the first place you would have instituted it. But you live in a society, the United States of America, which has never had democracy in the workplace. You go to work in a corporation today, there's a group of people, the board of directors, 15. They make all the decisions. What you produce, how you produce, where you produce, and what gets done with the profits you help to produce. You know what your influence is on those decisions? Zilch, nothing. There is no democracy in the workplace. You live in a country that is fighting wars halfway around the world to bring to those countries a democracy we don't have. You wonder why they are critical of us. Are you kidding? You must be kidding. Democratize the enterprise. That means a worker co-op, a democratic way to decide what is done with the surplus that everybody helps to produce. Would it make a difference? Oh boy, would it make a difference. Let's give some examples to end. Suppose over the last 40 years, when this country has been torn apart, as we're seeing in the presidential race and everything else in this country right now. Over the last 40 years, this country has been torn apart by, among other things, the exodus of large numbers of companies that left the United States, continue to leave the United States, because they can hire people for much less money over there, particularly in Asia, but not just there. Detroit went from a city in 1970 of 2 million people, the showcase of capitalism in America, to a disaster today. The population of Detroit today is 700,000 people. The majority of people driven out of their homes, their jobs, their churches, and their schools. It's a collapsed city. You should, if you've not visited it, visit Detroit. Nothing I say will teach you as well as 2 hours driving through it. Now, suppose the decision where you locate production was not made by a board of directors looking to make more money, but by a democratic decision of all the workers working there. You think they would have canceled out their jobs? You think they would have moved the factory, destroyed their community? Never happened. The history of this country would have been radically different. Here's another example. At the end of each year, when the company looks at its profits, all the surplus it's gotten out of its workers, who decides what to do with the profits? It's a wonderful moment for those of you who've never been that place. Imagine yourself for a moment in the Christmas party at the end of the year. Your three-quarters drunk CEO gets up on a wobbly table and makes in slurred speech, "Thank you, all of you, for having worked so hard to make this a successful year," and then he falls off the chair. Okay? The next morning, that drunk CEO will get together with his other CEOs, or whatever O's they are, and they will decide what to do with the profits. He will have thanked you for producing it, but participate in the decisions? Oh no. And if that decision means closing the factory, you lose your job? Tough. If it means using a new technology that pollutes the air that your children breathe? Tough. You don't participate. You are excluded. And you know, this comes as a surprise to many of you. Over the last 40 years, as these companies have made really big profits off of your labor, and they sit around the board of directors and the major shareholders, by the way, 20, 30 people usually, and they decide what to do with it, here comes a shock. They've decided to distribute a large part of it to themselves. What a shocker. In very high wages and dividends which go to the shareholders, which is what they are. That's why we have a growing inequality of income in this country. There's no mystery here. This has got nothing to do with education or technology. Stop! This is because we allow a tiny group of people at the top to decide what to do with the surplus we all help to produce, and they give a disproportionate amount to themselves. So we have, on the one hand, the richest people imaginable, and on the other hand, the first generation of American college students who can't get a degree without going into tens of thousands of dollars of debt. You are being ripped off here. And that's what Marxism and socialism have always had as their first thought. Appeal to the people who are the victims of capitalism, so that they begin to understand that you can do better than this system. And a worker co-op starts at the bottom and represents a new direction for socialism. That's why in Bernie Sanders' economic platform, a little bit about co-ops. Not a lot, but he's getting it. It's getting there. If you want an example of a politician today who's gotten much further, Jeremy Corbyn, Great Britain, the leader of the Labour Party. They have the most, interesting for those of you who follow politics, the most developed understanding of the need to develop a socialist co-op sector separate from and in competition with capitalism is emerging in Great Britain under the leadership of the Labour Party under its new leader, Jeremy Corbyn, with concrete policy proposals, which, if you're interested, I'll lay out for you when we're done. Socialism is emerging now with a new direction and a new definition. And not the least interesting thing for you to watch in the years ahead in your lifetimes will be the success of this, partly because the entire anti-socialist apparatus is completely focused on what socialism isn't anymore. and completely unprepared to cope with what socialism is now becoming. That's one of the not so good results of a repression of your counter ideology for 50 years. Let me stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.